Everybody. This is an example of a close reading, how to analyze an argument, step 1. You can access this example one of two ways, either through this video form or through a transcript, whatever is the most comfortable for you, both of which are available on Blackboard. Now, in Chapter 3, you are asked to analyze an argument, Linda Smith's Disconnected, by following the instructions below. Conduct a paragraph-by-paragraph analysis. How is this essay argument built? Identify the thesis claim and decide if Smith does a good job in using it as the roadmap through her essay. That is, does Smith organize her essay according to the details or elements of her thesis? 3, list Smith's support. That is how she constructs her claim through her body paragraphs. List Smith's counterarguments to any opposition that's offered. Describe the elements of Smith's conclusion. Decide if Smith is able to persuade her audience to accept and agree with her claim. Why or why not? Are organization, support, counter-arguments, and/or her conclusion a factor in your decision? Note, a solid answer to this question 6 would actually be your thesis or claim if you were asked to analyze Smith's argument. So keep that in mind. This sounds like an awful lot, and I promise with practice it will become second nature to you, but for now, I'm happy to help. To illustrate how a textual analysis works, how you can actually eventually answer these questions, I'm going to show you how to do a close reading of the text in an analytical way. I'm going to use an opinion article from the New York Times, My Life as a Dog, written by Jonathan Foer. I'm going to do this on my laptop, obviously, in Adobe, working on a PDF version of the essay, but you can write out your notes in a notebook, whatever is most comfortable for you. Now, to access the essay, you can do a couple of things. You can either go online directly and access the New York Times article, or you can access the PDF version of the essay in Blackboard. So let's talk about this idea of a close reading first and why it's important. A close reading is something to get used to in college and in the workplace. We are used to skimming information or reading for entertainment. In college and at work, we will have to retain what we read to apply later for a test or a project. We may be asked to assess what we read to determine if the information is credible or not. So this requires a close reading. In college and at work, there is just so much information coming our way, and to retain that information for a later time is just impossible given our hectic personal and professional lives. A close reading allows us to retain information and use it later in a meaningful way. It feels more time-consuming, but it actually saves time in the long run, I promise, because you can use your work product from a close reading later with having to reread and reread the information each time that you need it. For our purposes, a close reading will give you material to use for a rough draft of a major writing project. Analyzing an argument is not an opportunity to argue about the topic. Rather, we are to remain neutral about the issue, even if we have strong opinions about it, and look instead at how the writer builds the argument. So our goal is to deconstruct or take apart the argument piece by piece, and then to determine if these pieces help or hurt the writer's attempt to persuade the audience to accept and agree with his claim. These pieces will be a claim, also known as a thesis, support, evidence, details, the writer's ability to explain the issues to his audience, the writer's ability to acknowledge his opposition and provide solid counterarguments, and the ability to offer a logical conclusion. Those are all the pieces that we're going to be looking at. The writer's tone or voice is also an important piece to an argument that may or may not contribute to the overall persuasiveness of the writing. So as we conduct a close reading of the text, we're going to look for these pieces and see what impact, if any, they have on the persuasiveness of the argument. My Life as a Dog by Jonathan Foer. For the last 20 years, New York City parks, without designated dog runs, have permitted dogs to be off-leash from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. Because of recent complaints from the Juniper Park Civic Association in Queens, the issue has been revisited. On December 5th, the Board of Health will vote on the future of off-leash hours. So if I were looking at this paragraph by paragraph, I would simply add a note here that says what is actually happening in this first paragraph. Foer introduces a problem or an issue, whatever you want to call it, which is the off-leash dog hours in New York City, which will cause a new vote on the issue of whether dogs should be allowed off their leashes during designated times. So notice that I am specific here. I don't stop with Foer introduces a problem. I give further information and further detail so that later when I want to recall this, I don't have to reread. I can just look at my notes. Now sometimes your notes are longer than the actual paragraph, and that's okay, because what you're doing is you are explaining this piece and where it fits in your analysis. So you're not just restating the paragraph, you are explaining the relevance of this paragraph. And for our purposes, the relevance is introducing this problem or issue and what the problem or issue is specifically, because there may be more problems or issues introduced later. We shall see. Retrievers in elevators, Pomeranians on number 6 trains, bull mastiffs crossing the Brooklyn Bridge. It is easy to forget just how strange it is that dogs live in New York in the first place. It is about as unlikely a place for dogs as one could imagine, and yet 1.4 million of them are among us. Why do we keep them in our apartments and houses, always at some expense and inconvenience? Is it even possible in a city to provide a good life for a dog? And what is a good life? Does the health board's vote matter in ways other than the most obvious? So here, Foer presents the problem or possible problem with owning a dog in an urban area such as New York City, and whether dogs even have a good life in this environment. And I think it's important to note that Foer doesn't offer his opinion at this point. All right, next paragraph, what's happening here? I adopted George, a Great Dane Lab, Pit Greyhound, Ridgeback, whatever mix, aka Brooklyn Shorthair, because I thought it would be fun. As it turns out, she is a major pain an awful lot of the time. So here we have the writer connecting himself to the issue by introducing his own dog, George, and admitting that she is a major pain an awful lot of the time. Now, the reason I put that in quotes is because I don't want to forget that those are the exact words of the writer. I want to make sure that later, if I use that quote, that I give credit through a citation, whether it's MLA or APA, that there is a citation from borrowing his exact words. She mounts guests, eats my son's toys, and occasionally tries to eat my son, is obsessed with squirrels, lunges at skateboards and hasids, has the savant-like ability to find her way between the camera lens and subject of every photo taken in her vicinity, backs her tush into the least interested person in the room, digs up the freshly planted, scratches the newly bought, licks the about to be served, and... oh, what happened? Huh. And occasionally relieves herself on the wrong side of the front door. Her head is resting on my foot as I type this. I love her. Now, what is happening here is that, holding on, it's not cooperating with me. What is happening here is that the author, I'll put my note here. There we are. 4 talks about all of the inconveniences or annoyances of his pet. But then, in contrast, states that as he writes of the problems, she is resting her head on his foot, and that despite her annoyances, he loves her. Please note that, as you can see, my sentences are run-on sentences. They are not all grammatically correct. You are not striving for pretty words and sentences. You are striving for a detailed note, paragraph by paragraph, about what is going on in the paragraph. Don't worry about pretty words and sentences. Worry about your content. You can always clean this up later. What is important is that you're not vague, because if you're vague, these notes aren't going to be useful to you later. So what I'm pointing out here is how the author talks about how inconvenient his dog is, and then in contrast turns around and says, she's laying on my foot as I write this, and I love her. Our various struggles to communicate, to recognize, and accommodate each other's desires, simply to coexist, force me to interact with something, or rather someone entirely other. George can respond to a handful of words, but our relationship takes place almost entirely outside of language. She seems to have thoughts and emotions, desires and fears. Sometimes I think I understand them. Often I don't. She is a mystery to me, and I must be one to her. So 4 talks about the relationship with an other or non-human that cannot talk, and how he and his pet must be mysteries to one another, but he acknowledges that she must have emotions nonetheless. Okay. Of course, our relationship is not always a struggle. My morning walk with George is very often the highlight of my day, when I have my best thoughts, when I most appreciate both nature and the city, and in a deeper sense, life itself. Our hour together is a bit of a compensation for the burdens of civilization, business attire, email, money, etiquette, walls, and artificial lighting. It is even a kind of compensation for language. Why does watching a dog be a dog fill one with happiness? And why does it make one feel, in the best sense of the word, human? So, 4 points out that he feels more human with his pet, even if he cannot talk to her. She is an escape from the rigors of the workplace and allows him to feel happy. Um, and able to appreciate life. Okay. It is children very often who want dogs. In a recent study, when asked to name the 10 most important individuals in their lives, 7 to 10-year-olds included 2 pets on average. In another study, 42% of 5-year-olds spontaneously mentioned their pets when asked, "Whom do you turn to when you are feeling sad, angry, happy, or wanting to share a secret?" Just about every children's book in my local bookstore has an animal for its hero. But then, only a few feet away in the cookbook section, just about every cookbook includes recipes for cooking animals. Is there a more illuminating illustration of our paradoxical relationship with the non-human world? Wow, okay. So, 4 offers statistics about the importance of pets for children. And then in the same sentence, notes that in the same vicinity of children's books with animals are cookbooks showing humans how to cook animals. 4 says this is an illustration of our paradoxical relationship with the non-human world. Okay, again, putting quotes there because I think it's important, seems to be an important part of the essay, and especially the tone. I can note that the tone changes here from friendly to more serious. And that's just my opinion, but that's, as a reader, that's what I see. There are not absolute right and wrong answers to how you interpret a paragraph as long as you do so in a detailed way. Of our lives, we move from a warm and benevolent relationship with animals, learning responsibility through caring for our pets, stroking and confiding in them, to a cruel one. Virtually all animals raised for meat in this country are factory farmed. They spend their lives in confinement, dosed with antibiotics and other drugs. Here, 4 shows the timeline from a loving relationship with animals to a cruel relationship with animals, specifically the factory farms where animals are confined and drugged. Okay, how do you explain this? Is our kindness replaced with cruelty? I don't think so. I think in part it's because the older we get, the less exposure we have to animals. And nothing facilitates indifference or forgetfulness so much as distance. In this sense, dogs and cats have been very lucky. They are the only animals we are intimately exposed to daily. So, 4 clarifies that we are not a cruel society, but because we are distanced from animals as we get older, we don't realize how they are being mistreated. Okay, and so one has to ask himself, why 4 stops here and clarifies that we are not a cruel society and tries to make an excuse for why we allow this cruelty to animals to happen. It might just be an innocent paragraph, but I wonder, as we look at the pieces of this argument, what would be his motivation in making sure that he lets his audience know that, you're not inherently bad. So think about that when you think about why this piece in the argument is inserted. Folk parental wisdom and behavioral studies alike generally view the relationships children have with companion animals as beneficial, but one does not have to be a child to learn from a pet. It is precisely my frustrations with George and the inconveniences she creates that reinforce in me how much compromise is necessary to share space with other beings. So here, the writer says that his relationship with his pet is beneficial in allowing compromise between himself and his non-human dog. And I think this idea of compromise is important, that reinforce in me how much compromise is necessary to share space with other beings. Okay, so as we move on, that idea of compromise may or may not be important, but it strikes me as an important term. Arguments against off-leash hours are easily refuted. So here we have 4 actually weighing in on the leash hour issue, which we haven't heard about since the first paragraph. And he says that the arguments against off-leash hours are easily overcome. One doesn't have to be an animal scientist to know that the more a dog is able to exercise its dogness, to run and play, to socialize with other dogs, the happier it will be. Happy dogs, like happy people, tend not to be aggressive. In the years that dogs have been allowed to run free in city parks, dog bites have decreased 90%. But there is another argument that is not so easy to respond to. Some people just don't want to be inconvenienced by dogs. Giving dogs space necessarily takes away space from humans. So here, 4 argues that the need for off-leash hours is clear in that it benefits dogs and makes dogs happier and less aggressive. He adds a statistic to support the idea that off-leash hours decreases the incident of dog bites. He then raises another concern that people just don't want to share space with dogs. Okay. We have been having this latter debate in different forms for ages. the debate being sharing space between humans and non-humans. So I think that that's an important issue. I might even want to highlight it. If I see something that seems important, I can do that too. Again and again, we are confronted with the reality, some might say the problem, of sharing our space with other living things, be they dogs, trees, fish, or penguins. Dogs in the park are a present example of something that is often too abstracted or far away to gain our consideration. So 4 in this, and I'm going to highlight the rest of this, he actually opens up the issue or expands the issue here from, let's see what I want to do here. We'll add it here. 4 expands the issue of off-leash laws to something larger, that is humans sharing space with non-humans. And I think that it is fine to go ahead and add the highlight, because I think this too is an important part of this discussion. And again, it's something that I see as important. Maybe you will not see it, and that's okay if you don't see that as important. You may go back later and decide that you want to flag something. This is just all how you perceive or look at this text, and you're going to do that in your own way. The very existence of parks is a response to this debate. Earlier, New Yorkers had the foresight to recognize that if we did not carve out places for nature in our cities, there would be no nature. It was recently estimated that Central Park's real estate would be worth more than $500 billion, which is to say, we are $500 billion inconvenienced by trees and grass, but we do not think of it as an inconvenience. We think of it as balance. Interesting. So I like this one. I like this sentence also. So I'll highlight it, and then I will add a note. 4 uses Central Park as an example of a financial sacrifice made by New Yorkers to preserve the natural world in an urban setting to maintain balance. And notice that I did put that in quotes because that's a term of art used by 4 in this text. Living on a planet of fixed size requires compromise, and while we are the only party capable of negotiating, we are not the only party at the table. I think this is so important, and I would argue that it might be the main idea or claim of 4, or part of it, because obviously a claim can come in multiple sentences. We are never claimed more, and we've never had less. There has never been less clean air or water, fewer fish, or mature trees. If we are not simply ignoring the situation, we keep hoping for and expecting a technological solution that will erase our destruction, while allowing us to continue to live without compromise. Maybe zoos will be an adequate replacement for wild animals in natural habitats. Maybe we will be able to recreate the Amazon somewhere else. Maybe one day we will be able to genetically engineer dogs that do not wish to run free. Maybe. But will those futures make us feel, in the best sense of the word, human? So again, another important thought to highlight. And here, just looking to see what 4 talks about, he says that compromise between humans and the non-human or natural world is not happening, and as we refuse to compromise, we lose our natural world. And he suggests maybe lose our humanness. And again, this is my interpretation of what's happening here. I have been taking George to Prospect Park twice a day for more than 3 years, but her running is still a revelation to me. Effortlessly, joyfully, she runs quite a bit faster than the fastest human on the planet, and faster I've come to realize than the other dogs in the park. George might well be the fastest land animal in Brooklyn. Once or twice every morning, for no obvious reason, she'll tear into a full sprint. Other dog owners can't help but to watch her. Every now and then someone will cheer her on. It is something to behold. The writer ends with describing his dog George running in the park and the impact that run has on her owner and others in the park. It is something to behold. And with that, this is the conclusion of the opinion. So we've done the first piece. We've gone through the argument piece by piece and summarized what was going on in the argument. Now we'll go back and look at those elements of an argument and see what paragraph could be labeled a particular element. So instead of trying to explain that, I'll just show you. Through the text one time, paragraph by paragraph, and sort of summarize what's happening each step of the way, I can think about those questions that we talked about when we were asked to analyze an argument. We did our paragraph by paragraph analysis. And when we look at how the argument or essay is built, we are looking for things such as the thesis or the main idea. So that's one of the things that we're looking for, that thesis or the main idea. And so I'll look at the text, and I tend to highlight areas where I think the main idea evolves. It is okay if you do not have one sentence as your main idea or your claim. Often it's in several sentences. And so I highlighted some ideas as I was going along that I thought were important to the author. And I think this is a part of the thesis. We have been having this later debate in different forms for ages. Again and again, we are confronted with the reality, some might say the problem, of sharing our space with other living beings, be they dogs, trees, fish, or penguins. Dogs in the park are a present example of something that is often too abstract or far away to gain our consideration. I think that's part of the main idea. We do not think of it, that is, sharing space with non-humans, as an inconvenience. We think of it as balance. Living on a planet of fixed size requires compromise. And while we are the only party capable of negotiating, we are not the only party at the table. So he endorses the idea of compromise and ultimately concludes that by sharing our space with the non-human world, we will be, in a sense, made more human. So I would take those sentences and put stars next to them, identifying them as part of his thesis or main idea. And don't be afraid, having done that, to then put it in your own words, because I think that when you identify the thesis, you have to do two things. The first thing you have to do is identify it in the text, and then you have to restate it in your own words. So in the essay, My Life as a Dog, Jonathan 4 argues that we must compromise as humans to share space with the non-human world to achieve a better quality of life, or to experience better our own humanness. And then I would say, in the essay, 4 specifically identifies his claim, and then I would put in those quotes that we talked about, and to prove that my interpretation of the main idea is found in the text itself. And then again, turning back to these questions, looking at the idea of how the essay is organized, we can talk about that. How does the essay organize itself around the claim? Well, again, if you look at the essay, there is an idea of 4 talking about the issues. In these 2 paragraphs, he talks about the leash law, he talks about the inconvenience of dogs, and then he balances that with his own personal experience of George, and talks about her annoyances, but also talks about the benefits of having him in her life. And he spends a lot of time in these paragraphs discussing his relationship with George. In this paragraph, he talks about statistics in terms of how children benefit from having pets. So he gives us a little bit of that, but then turns to the paradox in that we love pets, but are also in the same world with an indifference to being cruel to the non-human world. And again, he talks about this paradox, moving from this warm relationship to a cruel one. Here he qualifies that his audience is not cruel, but just a little detached from the situation. And so it's sort of his job to bring us closer to the situation so that we can, yield his call to action. And that is that idea of compromising. Again, he goes back to George and this idea again of compromise. And he says it's precisely my frustrations with George. In other words, his relationship with George teaches him how much compromise is necessary to share space with other beings. And then he goes back to the leash law. He gives us some more statistics. His main idea emerges here. He gives us some evidence about how balance is achieved in New York City with maintaining the natural space of Central Park. So he uses that as evidence that we don't think of that as an inconvenience. We think of it as balancing an urban setting with the natural world. And again, he goes back to his main idea. And then he ends with George. He ends with his relationship with George and how there is this awesomeness to simply watching his dog run in the park. So when we go back to the idea of listing perhaps the evidence or support of the claim, there are some statistics, but there's a lot of personal testimonials about Four's own relationship with his pet George and the benefits he gains from that relationship. So he also gives us this evidence of Central Park as a point of balance in New York City between the urban setting and the natural world. So when I identify the evidence or support that's found, and maybe you'll think of some others, he gives us some statistics. The bulk of it, and I might put a star there, is personal testimonials about his relationship with George. He gives us Central Park. And so what you have to decide is whether or not this evidence is effective in terms of supporting his claim, if it was a good strategy, if these pieces are solid and contribute to the overall persuasiveness of this idea that we just came up with. Going back to these questions, we looked at this idea of support, and then we have to look at counter arguments. Now remember that in an argument, 4 will have his position. 4's position is to balance or compromise between humans and non-humans and share the space. His opposition would be any place in the essay in which he identifies people who would oppose his position. And so again, you would go back to the essay looking for points of opposition. And he talks, I think, about the idea of just being inconvenienced, the idea of animals being an annoyance or an inconvenience. And I think that's early in the essay. This idea of an inconvenience is an opposition, is a point of opposition. Pets are an inconvenience in human space. And the question is, does 4 provide a counter argument to this point of opposition? And I think he does. He basically says that yes, they are an inconvenience, but paradoxically, they are worth it. And if you look in back again, he says here that yes, she is a pain. I admit that. But his relationship with her gives him happiness, and he feels more human. That escape from his job, from the burdens of civilization. So the counter argument is that the inconvenience is made up by the escape from the difficulties of life and the joy that pets provide. So he does provide a counter argument. Now, whether or not you feel that counter argument is a good one is up to you when you analyze that piece of the text. So again, if we go back to the questions, that's what we're talking about when we talk about counter arguments. The conclusion is really back to George running in the park. If you recall, he talks about, he doesn't give a long restatement of his argument. He just says, look, I take George to the park, and there's this moment when she runs, and people turn around to watch. It's just something to behold. There's just something wonderful about it that makes you feel wonderful. So he concludes with George. The conclusion returns to his personal testimonial about the wonder and joy gained from simply watching George run in the park, rather than restating his argument about the leash law or sharing space with animals, he decides to just relate this personal experience with George. And so you have to decide again, is this piece effective? Is this a good way to conclude this in terms of persuading the audience of his overall claim? And again, that's something that you have to decide. So we've talked about the conclusion. And then finally, once you've done this, you've gone through the parts, you have to decide if Smith is able to persuade the audience, well, actually 4 in this case, if 4 is able to persuade the audience to accept and agree with his claim about the benefits of sharing space with non-humans, and why or why not. And so you'll go back through the argument and discuss these items that we just went over and decide if they are a plus or a minus in terms of making 4's claim persuasive. And that's really what analyzing a text is. Notice that I'm not arguing the point. I'm not jumping into the argument about leash laws or about whether or not we should share space. I'm looking at how 4 builds his argument, what his claim is, and whether or not he has built an argument to effectively persuade his audience of his overall claim. Hopefully this example helps you to see how to analyze a text, and in this case, an argument.